Picasso by Gertrude Stein. One whom some were certainly following was one who was completely charming. One whom some were certainly following was one who was charming. One whom some were following was one who was completely charming. One whom some were following was one who was certainly completely charming. Some were certainly following and were certain that the one they were then following was one working, was bringing out of himself then something. Some were certainly following and were certain that the one they were then following was one bringing out of himself then something that was coming to be a heavy thing, a solid thing, and a complete thing. One whom some were certainly following was one working, and certainly was one bringing something out of himself then, and was one who had been all his living, had been one having something coming out of him. Something had been coming out of him, certainly had been coming out of him, certainly it was something, certainly it had been coming out of him, and it had meaning, a charming meaning, a solid meaning, struggling meaning, a clear meaning. One whom some were certainly following, and some were certainly following him, one whom some were certainly following was one certainly working. One whom some were certainly following was one having something coming out of him, something having meaning, and this one was certainly working then. This one was working, and something was coming then, something was coming out of this one then. This one was one, and always there was something coming out of this one, and always there had been something coming out of this one. This one had never been one, not having something coming out of this one. This one was one having something coming out of this one. This one had been one whom some were following. This one was one whom some were following. This one was being one whom some were following. This one was one who was working. This one was one who was working. This one was one being one having something coming out of him. This one was one going on having something coming out of him. This one was one going on working. This one was one whom some were following. This one was one who was working. This one always had something being coming out of this one. This one was working. This one always had been working. This one was always having something that was coming out of this one that was a solid thing, a charming thing, a lovely thing, a perplexing thing, a disconcerting thing, a simple thing, a clear thing, a complicated thing, an interesting thing, a disturbing thing, a repellent thing, a very pretty thing. This one was one certainly being one having something coming out of him. This one was one whom some were following. This one was one who was working. This one was one who was working, and certainly this one was needing to be working so as to be one working, one being working. This one was one having something coming out of him. This one would be one all his living having something coming out of him. This one was working, and then this one was working, and this one was needing to be working, not to be one having something coming out of him, something having meaning, but was needing to be working so as to be one working. This one was certainly working, and working was something this one was certain this one would be doing, and this one was doing that thing. This one was working. This one was not one completely working. This one was not ever completely working. This one certainly was not ever completely working. This one was one always having something being coming out of him, something having completely a real meaning. This one was one whom some were following. This one was one who was working. This one was one who was working, and he was one needing this thing, needing to be working so as to be one, having some way of being one, having some way of working. This one was one who was working. This one was one having something come out of him, something having meaning. This one was one always having something come out of him. And this thing, the thing coming out of him, always had real meaning. This one was one who was working. This one was one who was almost always working. This one was not one completely working. This one was one not ever completely working. This one was not one working to have anything come out of him. He always did have something having meaning that did come out of him. He always did have something coming out of him. He was working. He was not ever completely working. He did have some following. They were always following him. Some were certainly following him. He was one who was working. He was one having something coming out of him, something having meaning. He was not ever completely working.